The name of this panel is Municipal Ungovernance, with "un" in parentheses. The panel, described in brief, is about how can we govern, and should we govern? So the two panelists I am very, very pleased to introduce are Nikita Oliver. In this room, I'm going to give her a brief one anyways. She's a Seattle-based writer, teaching artist, attorney, and organizer. She's also very well known, of course, for being one of the most, well, the most exciting candidate in the recent mayoral election. Kalia Kuno was previously introduced, but just as a reminder, he's a leading organizer of Cooperation Jackson, and recently has spearheaded the launch of the Red Path Organizing Committee. So to get this started then, I just want to ask a question to really just set the tone. In brief, what is your perspective? What in your perspective are the main forces, the major forces currently shaping the places you do work in? Pretty much for folks who might not be aware, what's the terrain of struggle look like? I'll start with Nikita for this one.
I'll keep it short because a lot of us are from this area. I mean, obviously the larger conversation about capitalism that was happening before and has been happening all day, development and the use of people and land as a way for building more and more wealth that is intentionally inaccessible to those of us that are not in the highest levels of that wealth gathering. Thanks a lot, Jeff Bezos. But it's, you know, if I were to just break it down to basic English, because that's one of the things I struggle with this conversation. I was telling Yen in the back, I was like, would you have the conversation that just happened with someone on the block in the hood? And if you did, would you have it the way it just happened? Probably not. So I'm thinking things like the housing crisis, homelessness and affordability, and our city's lack of view of people's human dignity and humanity in that, which for me is I ask myself, what's underneath that, and why do we push towards development and fences as opposed to affordable housing and more places for people to live? It's because the city does not value those of us who don't make more than 6 figures a year, and those of us who are not interested in continuing to invest in capitalism. And so our education system, the prison industrial complex, the building of a new youth jail, literally right there because of the lack of value for black and brown youth and black and brown people, but continuing to use people as capital. So I think the biggest issue we face is really our city's lack of value for actual people. Seattle only values a certain type of person, and it's certainly not the ones that are going to challenge the establishment or what the establishment values around development. And since we're on Duwamish land, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the city does not value land or the people that were here first, because to value that would mean that we'd have to change the way that we function. And so at the root of it, it really is a value issue and a lack of value for human dignity and our value for creation.
You know, it's interesting to try and talk about this question given the difference of the context. You know, Seattle is now situated where I think it was like 5 or 6 of the 20th most wealthy people on the planet live, or something like that, if I remember correctly. And we have 2 in Mississippi who are up there, but they're not at Bezos level, but they're up there. But Mississippi overall, you know, why I'm struck, Mississippi is every place is unique. So let me not say that. But Mississippi exists within a particular relationship to capitalism as it's been practiced in the United States. It's a plantation that is very much about keeping relationships stuck in the 19th century as much as possible. And it's a place where, in very odd ways, capital actually doesn't run the show. Now, what do I mean by that? Because clearly it does. Don't get me wrong. There's a ruling class. It's an old settler, class rooted in the plantation. But there's a dynamic in Mississippi where I've had very clear encounters when you push certain buttons and certain forces very clearly on that ruling class side. They would straight up tell you, I'd rather have social control than to make more money. Like in our context. Because we've been in some weird situations. I remember maybe about 10 years ago, being in a conversation where my ass was actually arguing with this, this businessman, kind of by happenstance, that if you do it this particular way, you'll actually make more money. Right? But the way in which I was suggesting, and this was one of my first kind of clear introductions to this dynamic, the way in which I was suggesting he go about doing business would have required him to give more money, pay higher wages, and give more control to black workers. And for a minute there in the conversation, he was all with it. Like, okay, yeah. But then something clicked. And to this day, I still don't know exactly what I said that triggered it, but he was like, he just paused and his whole demeanor just shifted. Then after about 30 minutes in the conversation, he was the first person to tell me, he said, if I did it, this is one thing I do love about Mississippi is that, folks will be very bluntly honest with you about their racism, where they stand. So, that's a big difference in the context. They will tell you straight up. And he just told me, he said, you're absolutely right. If I moved in the way that you're suggesting, I would make more money. But if I did that, I'd lose control. And I'd rather have control. And I was sitting there, as a comic, I was sitting there shocked, like, wait a minute, you actually don't want to make more money? I don't quite understand this. So it took me a minute to really try to sit down and understand what is this dynamic. Because I'm originally from California, not from Mississippi. And so I'm sitting there, with my little Los Angeles education and I'm like, I just don't understand what I just heard. This don't make no sense. But living there now, and I have a deeper understanding, a deeper appreciation of that local context and what it means. And why I bring it up, because there's some critical differences about how different portions of this empire are ruled that require us to engage in different types of strategies and tactics to confront it. And I think we have to be very mindful of being as concrete as possible about the forces that we are contending with in our particular areas. So for us, I think here there's some big players that you guys can clearly identify. For us, there's some very clear players to identify as well. And so to answer your question concretely, the major driving forces in our area is not finance capital per se as it is here. And our area is still very much a landed kind of gentry, plantation gentry, that is loosely tied to oil and is still very much tied in land investment in Mississippi, which they don't want to break and have no intention to break. But they're trying to experiment in our areas with a very controlled form of gentrification because they are under some illusion that they're going to draw in more white people, in particular, to live in Jackson without paying them higher wages. So they've already created a certain kind of contradiction that we are very much opposed to generation and going to fight it tooth and nail. But we are also aware of the dynamic that they're creating. The only forces that they're going to get to come into, the leading project of the dynamic in our area is a medical corridor that they're trying to develop. And this corridor is specifically designed to do what they call ethnomedicine, meaning that they want to create drugs, specific drugs in the research program that try to target why black people in particular suffer from heart disease, hypertension, high blood pressure, etc. So that makes very ethnocentric, specific, as they believe they can, drugs to deal with these things. So that they're going to profit off the poverty and the misery both ways, with this particular try to develop. But they think they're going to get folks to come in and pay them, bottom line wages, when the reality of the situation, if they go forward with their program, the vast majority of the people that they're going to actually attract to come in will be foreign nurses and doctors who are looking to get an entry into the U.S. market and will take 5 to 10 years to sacrifice at their lower wage, rather than someone who is here will not do that. So I'm bringing this up because there's a certain part, as we believe, and we can speak to that later, that we can actually defeat in our context in Mississippi. But there's a certain part of it which we're not conceding to the reality, but to that as an eventuality, I should say. But we're also mindful of, given the nature of the contradiction, there's some room for us to do some organizing prefiguratively to say if new communities come in, we should be at the forefront of organizing those communities. And we should be the welcoming committee of those communities that are going to come in, rather than have another generation of folks come in and just be taught, there's a group of people here that you don't want to fuck with. Like the black people, you stay the fuck away from them because they're nothing but trouble and not worth your time and energy. And this is how you're supposed to treat them. Like that is the general education, if we get to the bottom line, how most immigrant communities are taught to relate to us in a particular dynamic. So us knowing that, how do we get ahead of it? So I don't want to speak too long, but I think it's us, we need the specificity in our analysis and the research that has to be done about what is so much different between Tacoma and Seattle, or Portland from Tacoma, to be able to really develop coherent, concrete strategies where we can really build power and challenge to take the whole piece.
So in the context you both have just described, what does state power and its manifestations in the Democratic and Republican parties look like in your localities? And is there a space to wield that state power to create or widen autonomous space? I'll let Kali take this one first.
Oh, no. Well, this is a controversial question. I'm sure here as it is everywhere. First, let me state what Mississippi is and how that question plays out. So, in general, if you believe the U.S. Census, Mississippi is roughly about 58% white and 40% black, but 2% other, which includes Choctaw, some Latino immigrants, and then a spattering of doctors from India, Nigeria, Ghana, and other kind of professionals that come in the community. Like that's what that 2% basically is. It's not a large migrant population that's coming to Mississippi because the economy just doesn't bear folks wanting to even come there to a certain extent. So within that dynamic, you could literally, over the past 40 years, look at election maps between red and blue. And that, when you look at what the final results are, you can tell exactly which race is where and who is in the majority. Like that is how politics is structured in Mississippi in the concrete. So, everything basically to the east of the Delta is majority white. That's all Republican. In terms of who wins and who controls those politics. Everything in the Delta and the black belt area of Mississippi is on the western side of the state, right? All of that is Democratic blue. Now, does that mean, to be more specific, that there is a deep loyalty, particularly amongst black folks, to the Democratic Party? The answer really is yes and no. There's a loyalty to the brand as being opposed to how the Republicans have been branded, at least since 1964, as the party of white supremacy. So the loyalty is to whatever's not openly and avowedly white supremacy, but it has the structure to kind of move on the ballot. That is what people have tended to, at least since 1968. So there's a loyalty to the brand. So folks should not be, confused about that. But are they committed to the politics of the Democratic Party? That's a different question. And that is what we've been trying to challenge in the broad we, is to say that we can articulate these interests and these politics in another political vehicle that is not the Democratic Party. Now that's more than a notion, however. And part of the thing that we really need to deal with is our own clarity around this question. And this is one of the questions I think left forces are the greatest confused about how to engage in electoral politics within this empire. One of the greatest confusions, which I think again rests in this problem of the lack of imagination, is that we confuse being able to impact policy with being able to govern, and we also confuse it with being in power, right? Sitting in an office does not mean having any form of power in this country. Everybody should be clear about that. I will argue with you that till the cows come home. Often, like what particularly when Chokwe won, many of you may have heard me, and I'll say it again. We didn't gain state power when Chokwe won in 2013. We won a popularity contest, which allowed us in a short period of time to adjust a few policies on a municipal level at its most strategic application. The greater point, I would argue, is if you're going to, or if we are going to be in any of these spaces, how can we use them to be a protagonist for class struggle and the struggle for the oppression of oppressed people, for the liberation of oppressed people? Which means, how do you place yourself in that position to actually challenge the normal functions of bourgeois order, which are to manage capitalism and to manage the contradictions of capitalism? Now that's easier said than done, because the pressure is, as we've experienced in Jackson, you get in office and people say, Jackson is infamous for having terrible roads. Anybody ever seen it? There's potholes the size of people all over the damn place. And so folks want to look, I put you in office to fix these potholes. And many of y'all may have heard both Chokwe's talk about this as an analogy, because there's a real application. But part of the thing is, can you fix that pothole, but also challenge the various forces that control the actual apparatus of the state in our area, which are the forces of capital? It's very hard to do. It's more than a notion, because what you basically surrender yourself is to say, on a certain level, I don't care if that pothole gets fixed. And you got to be willing to say that and fight for that with an understanding that's likely to mean that your ass ain't gonna get elected the next go around. So the question we have to pose is, are we there to get elected, or are we there to move the needle around certain politics? And that's, to me, what the ungovernable aspect of being a protagonistic, if you're gonna use that venue, has to be a movement towards. And the last thing I'll say, there's a lot I can say on this, but the last thing I'll say, we need our own vehicle. The Democrats and those, that's two sides of the same coin. I think we just need to be honest and open about that. So we need our own vehicle. And we need to be comfortable with understanding that us creating our own vehicles means that in the short term, and maybe even in the midterm, we won't get elected to various offices. And we got to be realistic that if we concede to joining the Democratic Party as a vehicle, I would argue to a certain extent that means that you really don't have that much faith either in the working class or oppressed people. Why do I say that? Because you're automatically putting yourself in alliance with petty bourgeois and ruling class forces by signing up to be a part of that particular phenomenon. And they are not going to let that go, and they're not going to let it bend to you in any form or fashion. And if you don't think the last experiment of Bernie Sanders is any indication that they're not going to let it go, we got a long trail of failed experiments trying to do that, basically since FDR took over the Democratic Party. And even before that, when black folks was in the majority of the Republican Party, before that, if you want to look at it. But this notion of organizing something independently is not an easy one. And I think that's part of the thing that we have to, really grapple with ourselves of understanding what it means to actually build a political vehicle that's going to engage in electoral politics that represent the interests of the working class and the oppressed as its own merit, not in alliance with these other forces that we would then be subject to.
So I think I can actually talk about this best within story, and the story as to why I ran for mayor and why the Seattle People's Party. I personally don't view the Dems and Republicans as different. As far as I'm concerned, both are preferential to white wealthy people invested in capitalism. And that's who they want to run. When I decided to run with the party and said we would be running as a third candidate, and that we would not be taking any corporate donations, multiple legislative districts reached out and said, we want to support your candidacy, we want to endorse you, but because you refuse to declare yourself a Dem, we're unwilling to do that and we won't share any of our resources with you. You're gonna have a really hard time winning this election. And luckily for us as a party, we'd already decided that this wasn't so much about winning the election as much as it was about base building. So when we decided to run, we were having conversations in November about the federal system and what was going on, and had settled on if we were going to have an impact on the material conditions of people's lives, it had to be hyper-local. And so we have three principles. We center the voices of the most impacted. If we're doing work that doesn't change the material conditions of people, then it's not the right work. And we have to be able to identify the difference between transformation and reform in the work that we're doing. Because reform is going to have long-lasting implications that might actually make transformation more challenging. And so we need to know the difference. And as we decided we're trying to figure out how we were going to construct a campaign, and we were getting a lot of threats. There's a reason why there were 21 candidates in this last mayoral election. There's a reason why 20 of them declared themselves Dems. Because there is this idea, Seattle is faux progressive, let's not lie to ourselves. Seattle serves white interests and wealthy interests, and typically cisgender male interests, because those are the interests that the city values. You can say we have finally elected the first woman in 91 years and she is openly a lesbian. And yet her policies look just like the guy that came before her, and the guy that came before her, and the guy that came before her, because they all are a part of this democratic machine. And so it's very intentional to say we don't want to run as a Dem, we want to run on a platform that is evolving. So that's the other risk we took, was we said I'm not gonna come out and give you a housing platform without first going and sitting with communities and having that platform be developed in an actual democratic way. Because we want to model what it looks like to actually have people's voices actively involved in the development of policy, as opposed to the bullshit we do now where the city says, here's this new policy, y'all are welcome to come make public comment on it, where you'll get 2 minutes to say something, and we may or may not listen to you at all, and we'll likely make backdoor deals and compromise anyways, so it really doesn't matter. And that was not the sort of process we wanted to model, nor was it the sort of process we wanted to participate in. So the strategy we developed was we told ourselves, look, in this first election, if we can get 5% of the vote, we've already won. We've already done what most third parties are not able to do in a city that basically is very proud blue. When we announced, and it looked like, I mean, this room here was full. It was packed. It was hot as hell in here. When we realized that getting 5% of the vote was actually going to be easier than what we thought, we knew we needed to grow our organizing strategy. And so it turned into looking at the 7 districts in our city and finding people in those districts who shared our values and were interested in building on our platform. And instead of us figuring out how to organize those districts, people who live in their own districts, who know the needs of their own districts, organize their own districts around the campaign. And so for us, the campaign wasn't so much about gaining power. Yes, becoming mayor would have been great. And I agree, you have to know that you may not get reelected. You have to go hard in the paint for that 4 years. And if you don't get reelected because you did some real shit and pissed off the right people, then that's okay. So our goal for what we were looking at was not so much about gaining power in the system, it was about empowerment of a base. Because to gain power in the system means that you're going to represent this system. And to be honest, as a candidate, that's something I really struggled with. To become mayor in Seattle would have meant to represent the interest of Seattle. And some of the interests of Seattle don't even represent me. As a renter, as someone who works full-time during the campaign, the only person who worked full-time of the 6 front runners who has no wealth. I didn't put my own money into the campaign. I put the $250 to start the bank account, but other than that, you know, it was really the $130,000 that was raised was by the base and was about the base. And so everything we did was about how do we invest that money back into our base. And in developing a platform that actually lives beyond the election. Because we knew not winning was a possibility, right? And so our question was for ourselves, how do we look beyond this seat and actually have a greater vision for what it means to create something that is sustainable, that actually has the possibility of being transformative for the city and actually changing the material conditions of people that are most impacted by the lack of housing affordability, by the lack of access to housing, by the lack of access to jobs, by the capitalist system that is running around us. How do we build a platform that then challenges whoever does get that seat to have to answer? And allowing our base to shape that narrative becomes about empowerment. I think when you get focused on getting elected for power, you're going to want to continue to use the power and authority of this system. When you're focused on getting elected for empowerment of a base, you're going to be accountable to a whole different set of values. And so I think that's the other part that matters is what are the values that are deciding how you're going to be a part of this system? Because whether you want to admit it or not, any of us who decide to get elected in the current system and take a seat, you become a part of it. The question about that is who are you accountable to? Because either you change the way that office functions, and when the next person gets into it, they either have to get with your program or they're gonna continue to be like, well, that's not how Nikita did it. Or the office is going to change you. And more times than not, we've seen people get into elected office, in this city in particular, on some pretty progressive values. And then when their time is up, they didn't do any of the shit they said because they were focused on getting reelected. So I think it's really about transitioning your thoughts about power. It's about who are you accountable to, and are you really making changes that change the material conditions of your base?
So, while it's fantastic to demarcate ourselves from the Democratic Party, objective reality doesn't always kind of leave a clear line in the sand for us to recognize. So with that in mind, I'd be interested in kind of delving a little bit more in terms of your experiences around the local Democratic Party and its structures, and I want to include in that as well its various extra parliamentary wings. So various union locals and their leadership, nonprofits that are connected up to the Democratic Party. How have you related to these organizations and their structures? How have you related around them, against them? And how have you been able to develop in relation to those forces? I'll let Nikita go first with this one.
Yeah, so we all know Seattle is like a big-ass nonprofit industrial complex. And they are not all our friends. Actually, most of them aren't, because in a lot of ways, The city has built itself on thinking that charity is the same thing as making real justice or change. In reality, a nonprofit that was truly interested in changing the material conditions of people would work itself out of a job. Like, it would not continue to exist because people would become empowered. So nonprofits would eventually move on into something else. So when we first declared, like I said, a lot of legislative, the Democratic legislative districts reached out and said, if you change to declaring Dem, we will likely endorse you. And a lot of this was a power move. It was, if you don't do it, you won't get access to our database. If you don't do it, you won't get access to our volunteer body. If you don't do it, there were a lot of consequences to not being a Dem, as opposed to saying, we see what you're doing. We know our party's fucked up because we just watched this last election, and we're going to support you regardless because we're willing to buck the system. If we can't admit that the Dems are a part of keeping the establishment in place, we're gonna have a really hard time moving beyond politics and business as usual. Because they are equally as white supremacists as the Republicans, and in fact, sometimes it's more infuriating because they use progressive language. They use our language to talk about things that we're fighting for without an actual analysis around it that leads to some sort of material change. And in fact, they don't come talk to black folks until it's time to vote. And then after we voted for them, nothing happens to actually serve our communities. You know, and so, to be honest, I don't know why black people keep voting for the Dems as a black person. And so there's a personal level about this as to why I'm not interested in continuing to work with a party that actually continues to build itself upon black bodies. Maybe it doesn't look the same way Republicans do it, but it is the same thing. And so I haven't seen any changes in the way we function in Seattle around that issue. And in a lot of ways, the unions are interconnected to that. Something that really pushed me over the edge during the election was the King County Labor Council refused to endorse our campaign. But as soon as the general election started, they would use my image and they would use the platform of the party as ammunition against Carrie Moon. We won't endorse you, but we'll use you to tear down this white woman we don't want while we're endorsing the establishment candidate. And that was it's problematic in the sense that it was using, once again, the face of black and brown peoples and the ways that we're organizing for ourselves as a way to propel their own establishment intentions. And we have to start talking about the fact that unions also have white supremacy in them. Unions also function sometimes on capitalism. And it's not to say, you know, like, I believe in the power of unions. But I also know that when it's developed within the context of the system, it internalizes the same mess. And if the work is not being done to uproot anti-blackness and to uproot patriarchy and to challenge capitalism, to truly give workers power, because there is a difference between the rank and file and who's empowering those unions and who's making those decisions. And we see that right now in unions, that there's a battle going on between the two. And we experienced this with our campaign. We would have rank and file members reach out to us and say, I want to organize on your campaign's behalf, but I know that the people who are making decisions within the union are not going to be okay with that. And those are interconnected in our inner city, nonprofits, unions, and the Dems. And if we're really going to make a change around how the politics of this city works, it has to be as a third party. I know that is a lot of work. I know that the base building takes a lot of time. I know that it's developing we're literally developing our own machine for elections. This is a 10-year vision right now, not a 1-year vision. There are 31,000 people in our database now. So in elections to come, how do we move to 61,000? How do we move to 91,000? How do we begin to build a base where the Dems can't say, if you want our registration and want our help, like, you got to get with our program? It's coercive. They want to coerce us into their way of doing things. And so, for me, the Seattle People's Party is about creating that long-reaching vision. around what does it look like to develop a sustainable model that's not just about elections. Elections is one thing. At the end of the day, running for office allows us to begin to build a system for running initiatives. It allows us to have a base of people in every single district that when things are going down, whether it's around housing, ICE, police, education, this jail, we can mobilize our base to actually start standing against those things and not be dependent upon the Dems to do it. And to be honest, not be dependent upon socialist alternatives. Socialist alternatives is like, Shama is holding it down in city council, but it's majority white. And Seattle People's Party is unapologetically about how do we represent the interests of black and brown peoples in this city, knowing that while the city might be majority white, anti-blackness is still at the root of that. So how do we start organizing a body of people who do unapologetically use anti-racist organizing principles, talk about capitalism and patriarchy, and really center the conversation around the brilliance of the most impacted, and not view lack of education or lack of access as some sort of determinant of worthiness.